And I was scared. I was scared that I would come to a town and I have the leader of the gang there telling me, what do you need? I was scared, but so was America. So was somebody else.
When police opened 2Pac's locked safe after his death, they expected money and jewelry. What they found instead made them freeze. Handwritten notes, secret documents, names that shocked investigators. Items that suggested 2Pac knew something dangerous, something he kept hidden from everyone. What was he protecting? And who was he afraid of? The city of Las Vegas never truly sleeps. But on that September night in 1996, something shifted in the air, something heavy and final that even the neon lights couldn't shake off. 2Pac Shakur, the voice of a generation, the poet who turned pain into power, was gone, and the world felt smaller without him, emptier somehow. But while the fans mourned openly, crying in the streets and leaving flowers at makeshift memorials, another kind of movement was happening behind closed doors, quiet, methodical, and far from the cameras. Police investigators, their faces showing the exhaustion of working a case that had already become legendary, were stepping into the private world 2Pac had built around himself for protection. They weren't heading to the recording studio, where he had poured his soul into tracks that would outlive him for generations to come. They weren't going back to the blood-stained intersection, where his life had ended in a hail of gunfire and chaos. No, they were going somewhere far more intimate, somewhere that held pieces of 2Pac that even his closest friends might never have seen. Hidden away from the chaos of his public life, tucked into a space meant only for him and his secrets, sat a locked safe, cold metal holding warm truths inside. The officers stood before it with a strange mix of duty and reverence, knowing that whatever lay inside could reshape the entire narrative of who 2Pac Shakur really was beneath the fame and controversy in music. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was a window into the mind of a man who had lived too fast and died too young to tell his full story. As they prepared to open it, the weight of the moment settled over them like a heavy blanket pressing down on their shoulders. Once that lock turned, once those contents spilled out into the light, there would be no going back to innocence. The legend of 2Pac might never look quite the same again. Dome Life. No one was meant to open. The safe itself seemed almost ordinary at first glance. Just a rectangular box of reinforced steel sitting in the shadows like a silent guardian of secrets. But the longer the investigators stared at it, the more it felt like something alive, something holding its breath and waiting for the inevitable moment when it would finally exhale and reveal what it had been protecting all this time. This wasn't the kind of safe you keep spare cash in or hide a few pieces of jewelry when you go on vacation for a week. No, this was the kind of safe you buy when you need to protect something that matters more than money. Something that could hurt you or someone else if it fell into the wrong hands at the wrong time in the wrong circumstances. One detective stepped forward, gloved hands steady despite the tension crackling through the room like static electricity before a summer storm rolls in, heavy and dark. The combination had been obtained through official channels, legal and proper, but that didn't make the act feel any less invasive, any less like trespassing into sacred ground that should have remained untouched and respected. He began to turn the dial, each click echoing louder than it should in the stillness of the room around them, each number falling into place like a countdown to something inevitable, something that couldn't be stopped once it started, no matter how much anyone might want to turn back time and leave the safe sealed forever in darkness and mystery. The other officers watched in silence, some with notebooks ready to document whatever emerged, others just standing witness to a moment that felt bigger than procedure. This wasn't just about solving a homicide case anymore. This was about understanding the man behind the music, the fears behind the fearless persona, the vulnerability hidden beneath all that defiance and swagger and carefully constructed armor. When the final tumbler clicked into place and the heavy door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the entire room, the investigators found themselves staring into a darkness that seemed deeper than the small space should allow, deeper than physics could explain, as if the safe had been holding more than just objects all this time. What they saw inside made them pause, made their breath catch in their chests like a hand had reached out and grabbed their hearts. These weren't the contents of a celebrity's safety deposit box filled with contracts and royalty statements and business papers. No, This was something far more personal, far more unsettling, far more human than any of them had expected to find behind that cold steel door. Handwritten pages lay stacked and scattered, some folded carefully, some crumpled in what looked like anger or fear or desperation, all covered in words that felt urgent and raw and painfully honest. There were photographs, documents, envelopes sealed and unsealed, items that clearly meant something to 2Pac, but whose significance wasn't immediately clear to anyone else standing in that room staring down at his most private possessions. The officers began to carefully remove each piece, treating them like fragile artifacts from a life cut tragically short before its time. With each item pulled from that safe, the mystery deepened, the questions multiplied, and the terrible possibility emerged that maybe, just maybe, 2Pac had known his time was running out, and had left these things behind for someone to find. Pages that sound like confessions. The first officer to actually touch the papers inside pulled them out slowly, almost reluctantly, as if moving too fast might damage something irreplaceable and precious. These weren't typed documents printed cleanly on expensive letterhead from lawyers or record labels representing corporate interests. No, these were handwritten notes scrawled in pen and pencil, the kind of writing you do late at night, when sleep won't come and thoughts won't stop. Some pages were dated, others had no indication of when they were written, or what had prompted the words to flow from his mind. The handwriting itself told a story, sometimes neat and controlled, other times jagged and rushed, like the pen could barely keep up with the speed of his thoughts. You could almost feel the emotion bleeding through the ink onto the paper in front of their eyes. The content made the investigators exchange uncomfortable glances across the dim room, filled with evidence and unanswered questions about a life cut short. These weren't song lyrics being workshopped for the next album release that would top the charts and sell millions of copies worldwide. These felt like confessions, like therapy sessions written to an audience of one, like a man trying to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense. Some entries read angry, filled with words that practically burned through the page with their intensity and barely contained rage at perceived betrayals. Others sounded scared, paranoid even, describing feelings of being watched, followed, targeted by people he couldn't always name, but knew were out there somewhere. The contrast was jarring, seeing this vulnerable side of someone the world knew as fearless and untouchable and larger than life itself. There were pages that mentioned betrayal by people close to him, friends who would become enemies or maybe had never been friends. Names appeared and disappeared throughout the notes, like ghosts haunting the margins of his private thoughts that no one was meant to read. Some entries questioned who he could trust anymore in an industry built on image and money and power and control over young talent. The investigators realized they weren't just reading evidence anymore. They were reading the unfiltered mind of someone who felt trapped despite his fame and success. This was 2Pac without the cameras, without the persona, without the armor he wore in public to protect himself from a world that wanted pieces of him. Just a young man trying to survive forces bigger than himself, in an industry that chewed people up. Was this just the stress of fame manifesting in worried words written late at night when paranoia felt reasonable and justified? Or had 2Pac genuinely stumbled into something darker? Something that made his fears not paranoia, but legitimate concerns for his own safety. The pages offered no clear answers, only more questions that deepened the mystery surrounding his death. Names that make investigators pause. As the officers continued sorting through the contents of the safe with meticulous care, certain words began appearing repeatedly across different pages and documents. Not random words, but names, specific names of specific people, some famous and some operating in shadows far from the spotlight and public attention. Each time a familiar name surfaced, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier with unspoken implications and uncomfortable possibilities. These weren't autograph requests or casual mentions of industry acquaintances 2Pac had met at parties or award shows or recording sessions. No, these were names written with purpose, often underlined or circled, sometimes followed by question marks or exclamation points that suggested emotion behind the mention. Some names appeared alongside dollar amounts, others next to dates, still others with brief cryptic notes that hinted at meaning only 2Pac would fully understand. Music industry executives appeared on the pages, powerful men who controlled careers and fortunes with the stroke of a pen on a contract. Street figures known to law enforcement also made appearances. People connected to the world Tupac had grown up in and never fully left behind, despite his success. The mixture of legitimate business and street connections painted a picture of someone straddling two worlds that didn't always coexist peacefully or safely. What made investigators pause wasn't just the names themselves, but the context in which they appeared throughout the scattered papers and documents. Some were listed together as if connected by invisible threads of business or conflict or mutual interest in something unexplained. Others stood alone, isolated, circled repeatedly like Tupac was trying to remember something important about them or warn himself to stay cautious and alert. The detectives stopped reading like fans admiring their favorite artist's private thoughts and started reading like investigators following a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest. Why would Tupac keep these specific names documented so carefully, so deliberately, yet locked away from everyone else in his life, including managers and lawyers and friends? What was the purpose of this record keeping, if not to protect himself somehow? Some names raised immediate red flags because of known conflicts that had played out publicly in diss tracks and interviews and confrontations. But other names seemed random at first, people with no obvious connection to Tupac or his world, until investigators started digging deeper. Connections began forming, patterns emerging from what had initially looked like scattered random thoughts, written without clear organization or purpose behind them all. The more they read, the more it felt like they were looking at a map, not of places but of people and relationships and debts and grievances. A map that Tupac had been quietly constructing, perhaps without even fully realizing what he was creating, or why he felt compelled to document everything so thoroughly and carefully in secret. Money, motives, and quiet deals. Among the handwritten notes and personal thoughts, investigators discovered something that made them slow down and pay even closer attention to every detail before them. Documents, receipts, what looked like informal contracts or agreements written on plain paper, without lawyers or witnesses present to verify their legitimacy or enforce their terms if disputes arose later between the parties involved in the deals. These weren't the polished contracts his record label lawyers handled with proper legal language and binding clauses protecting all parties involved in business transactions. No, these were handshake deals put to paper, the kind of agreements made in back rooms and private meetings far from the official channels that govern the entertainment industry. The kind of deals that happen when people don't want official records or paper trails leading back to them. Money appeared throughout these documents in amounts that range from thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, changing hands for reasons not always clearly stated. Some entries showed money going out, others showed money coming in, creating a flow of cash that existed parallel to his legitimate income from album sales and concerts. Nothing appeared illegal on the surface when read individually, but taken together, the pattern felt suspicious and raised questions about what was really happening. Who owed Tupac money and why? What services or favors or protections were being paid for in these quiet transactions between powerful people? More troubling, who did Tupac owe? And what leverage did that give them over a man whose public image was built on independence and refusal to bow to anyone? The power dynamics suggested by these documents painted a picture far different from the fearless rebel the world knew. Some pages listed names next to amounts with dates that corresponded to significant events in Tupac's career, album releases, tour dates, public conflicts that had made headlines. The timing felt too deliberate to be coincidental, suggesting money was moving because of specific situations or to resolve specific problems that required financial solutions, rather than public confrontations that might damage reputations or careers or business relationships. Investigators wondered if this was protection money, investment deals gone sideways, debts from street life that fame couldn't erase, or something else entirely that they weren't seeing clearly yet. Why would someone as successful as Tupac need to document these transactions so carefully unless he worried about being cheated or needed proof of agreements if things went wrong? Or was this his insurance policy, evidence he could use to protect himself if someone tried to silence him? The documents suggested a man caught between worlds, trying to navigate legitimate business while still connected to street codes and underground economies that operated by different rules. The question haunting investigators was whether this dual existence had put a target on his back, that fame and fortune couldn't protect him from when the danger finally came. Fear hidden behind fame. The deeper investigators dug into the safe's contents, the clearer a troubling pattern became that contradicted everything the public thought they knew. 2Pac Shakur, the man who rapped about fearlessness and defiance, who stared down cameras with unwavering confidence and challenged anyone who crossed him, had been deeply afraid. The private writings revealed someone who felt constantly watched, perpetually threatened, surrounded by danger he couldn't always identify or escape from no matter how successful he became. Entries described sleepless nights worrying about who might be plotting against him in rooms he'd never enter, and conversations he'd never hear. He wrote about feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by people constantly, never knowing who genuinely cared about him, versus who saw him as a meal ticket or stepping stone. The loneliness bleeding through the words felt profound and heartbreaking. A young man drowning in fame while desperately searching for something real to hold on to. Some notes mentioned specific incidents that had made him suspicious, moments when friends had acted strangely or business associates had made decisions that didn't make sense. He questioned motives constantly, analyzing interactions and conversations for hidden meanings and potential betrayals. The paranoia wasn't abstract, it was detailed and specific, naming situations and people who had given him reason to doubt their loyalty and question their true intentions toward him. What struck investigators as particularly sad was how 2Pac seemed to recognize his own fear and almost resent it, as if being afraid meant weakness. He wrote about needing to project strength publicly, while privately feeling vulnerable and exposed to forces beyond his control. The mask he wore for the world was apparently exhausting, but taking it off felt too dangerous in an environment where showing weakness could get you hurt or worse. The soap opera twist became impossible to ignore. The fearless revolutionary image was a performance, necessary for survival but not reflective of his internal reality. Behind the bravado and aggression and defiant persona lived someone profoundly aware of his own mortality and the dangers surrounding him. The tragic question hanging over everything was whether his fear had been justified, whether the threats he sensed were real, and whether documenting everything in this safe had been his way of leaving evidence behind in case something happened to him. Something? As investigators continued examining the safe's contents with growing fascination and concern, a disturbing theory began forming among them that changed how they viewed everything. What if this safe wasn't just random personal storage for a celebrity's private thoughts and business records that he wanted kept secure? What if 2Pac had deliberately organized these materials, intentionally preserved this evidence, knowing someone would eventually find it when the time came, and circumstances demanded answers he might not be alive to provide? The placement of items seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Documents stacked in a certain order, notes folded in specific ways, photographs positioned precisely. For someone whose public image was chaotic and spontaneous, the organization inside this safe felt methodical and purposeful, like he'd been building a case file against invisible enemies. Every piece seemed chosen for a reason, save because it meant something important in a larger story he was documenting. Some investigators suggested the safe was never meant for police at all, but for someone else, perhaps a trusted friend or family member who would understand the significance of what they found. Maybe it was a backup plan, a silent message waiting patiently in darkness to be discovered if something happened to him. The items inside would tell a story he couldn't tell himself, connect dots he couldn't connect publicly, without putting himself in even greater danger than he already faced. The question hung heavy in that room, like smoke that wouldn't clear no matter how much air circulated through the space. Did 2Pac know his life was in danger, not just abstractly but specifically and imminently enough to prepare this archive of evidence and information? Had he felt death approaching like a storm on the horizon, giving him time to arrange his thoughts and documents for those who would come searching for truth after he was gone? Some notes seemed addressed to no one in particular, yet everyone simultaneously. Explanations of situations and relationships that only made sense if you assumed the writer wouldn't be around to clarify them later. The tone in certain entries felt final, like someone tying up loose ends and making sure the record was straight before time ran out. It was heartbreaking to read, this young man apparently preparing for his own death while still living his life publicly. The investigators realized they might be holding exactly what Tupac intended them to find, a roadmap through the complicated, dangerous world that had surrounded him, left behind deliberately so truth wouldn't die with him. Not everyone agreed on what the safe's contents actually meant or represented in the larger investigation into Tupac's death and the circumstances surrounding it. As word leaked about what had been found, supporters and skeptics began forming opposing camps with completely different interpretations of the exact same materials. The divide revealed how complicated it was to separate Tupac, the artist, from Tupac, the person, the performance from the reality underneath all the fame and mythology. Supporters argued passionately that everything inside was simply creative material being misread by people who didn't understand artistic process or how musicians work. Rappers write from imagination and emotion, they reasoned, creating narratives and characters that don't necessarily reflect literal truth or actual events in their lives. The notes could be as lyrics in development, story ideas for future albums, creative writing exercises that had nothing to do with real danger or genuine fear he was experiencing. These defenders pointed out that Tupac was a trained actor and poet before becoming a rapper, someone who understood storytelling and character development deeply. He created personas and narratives professionally, they insisted. So, assuming everything he wrote was autobiographical confession, showed fundamental misunderstanding of how art works. The safe might just contain his creative workspace. Private thoughts never meant to be analyzed as evidence of criminal activity or dangerous situations he found himself trapped within. But critics saw something darker in those documents, something that transcended artistic expression and entered territory of genuine documentation and real fear. They argued the specificity was too detailed, the names too real, the money too documented to dismiss everything as fictional creative exploration. This wasn't metaphorical poetry about struggle, they insisted. This was a man genuinely trapped in conflicts bigger than music, documenting reality, not imagining fiction for entertainment purposes. The debate highlighted how thin the line between art and reality had become in Tupac's life and career, which fed off authenticity and street credibility. He'd built his reputation on keeping it real, on representing genuine struggle and danger. So, where did performance end and actual life begin in his work? Could investigators trust anything in the safe as factual when his entire career involved blurring truth and performance until nobody could distinguish between them anymore? This question had no easy answer, and both sides made valid points that couldn't be easily dismissed or disproven completely. The safe had raised more questions than it answered, leaving everyone uncertain what was real versus what was theater, in the complicated life of an artist who'd made his name being impossible to categorize or fully understand. The public never saw everything. The most frustrating part of the entire discovery wasn't what investigators found inside Tupac's safe, but what happened to those items after they were carefully cataloged and documented according to proper procedure. Not everything made it into public record, not everything was released to media outlets hungry for information, and not everything was shared with the family members desperate for answers about what had really happened to their beloved son and brother, who'd been taken too soon. Some items disappeared immediately into evidence storage, locked away in rooms that required special clearance and authorization to access even for investigators working the case. Others were sealed by court order, deemed too sensitive or potentially damaging to ongoing investigations to be shared with anyone outside a small circle of officials. The secrecy fueled suspicion and anger from people who felt they deserved to know the truth about what Tupac had left behind in that safe. Conspiracy theories exploded across internet forums and fan communities, trying to make sense of the silence and official explanations that felt inadequate. What were authorities hiding? People demanded to know, and more importantly, who were they protecting by keeping information locked away from public scrutiny? If the safe contained evidence of who shot Tupac or why he lost his life, didn't his fans and family have a right to know those answers regardless of how uncomfortable or complicated the truth might be? Some investigators who'd seen the contents spoke carefully in hushed tones about items that raised questions they weren't allowed to pursue fully because of pressure from above. Names that couldn't be investigated because of political connections, documents that implicated people too powerful to touch, evidence that pointed toward conclusions the department wasn't willing to officially acknowledge or act upon despite what the materials clearly suggested about motives and suspects and dangerous relationships. The selective release of information created a narrative with massive holes in it that people filled with speculation and theories ranging from plausible to completely absurd. Official statements claimed certain items were withheld to protect the integrity of ongoing investigations, but as hours passed without arrests or breakthroughs, that explanation felt increasingly hollow and unconvincing to anyone paying attention to the case and its lack of progress toward justice. What made people angriest wasn't just the secrecy, but the inconsistency. Some information leaked, while other details remained locked down tight, without clear explanation why. The safe that was supposed to provide answers had instead created new mysteries, new reasons to distrust official narratives, new fuel for those who believed 2Pac's death involved more people and darker motives than anyone wanted to publicly admit or investigate thoroughly, despite the evidence sitting in storage somewhere collecting dust. Still locked away. Years have passed since that safe was opened in a quiet room by investigators who expected to find simple personal belongings, and instead discovered a complicated web of fear, documentation, and unanswered questions. The safe itself has long been empty, its contents scattered between evidence lockers, sealed court files, and the few items eventually returned to family members who guard them fiercely from public view and media scrutiny that never really stopped or lost interest in the story. But the questions that spilled out that day remain as present and unanswered as ever, haunting everyone who cares about truth and justice. Did the safe hold the answers investigators needed to solve 2Pac's homicide case and bring those responsible to face consequences for ending such a bright and talented young life? Or did it simply contain more questions, more complications, more threads that led nowhere except deeper into a maze with no exit or clear path forward toward resolution? The public will likely never know the full truth about what those pages said or what those documents proved or suggested about the final months of 2Pac's life. Families guard their privacy, investigators protect their cases, and powerful people mentioned in those notes have every reason to keep certain information buried forever, where it can't damage their reputations or careers or implicate them in anything that happened back in 1996 when the music stopped and the legend began. What remains undeniable is how the safe changed the conversation about 2Pac's death, from simple gang violence or random tragedy to something potentially more complex and sinister. It gave weight to theories that had been dismissed as paranoid conspiracy thinking, suggested that maybe 2Pac's fears weren't irrational paranoia, but reasonable responses to real dangers he faced from multiple directions simultaneously, from the streets and the industry, and people he'd trusted who might have betrayed him. One thing is absolutely clear even now, even in death, even decades later, 2Pac's story refuses to end cleanly or resolve satisfactorily for those seeking closure. His life, like his music, fades out on an unresolved note that keeps people listening and wondering and searching for meaning in the silence. The safe was supposed to provide answers, but instead became another chapter in a story that may never be fully told or completely understood by anyone. The legacy isn't just the music or the movies or the poetry, it's also the mystery, the questions, the sense that something important remains locked away, waiting patiently in darkness for the right moment or the right person to finally bring it into the light where truth can breathe and justice can finally be served.